Six Tudor Queens, Jane Seymour, The Haunted Queen, Part 2. Today I want to talk about the third book in the series, Six Tudor Queens, The Haunted Queen by Alison Weir. This video has been broken into 3 parts because it is so long. The third part of this review will be coming out after Christmas. This video will be the third in a series covering Alison Weir's Six Tudor Queen novels and her other books. I love Alison Weir as an author of both historical fiction and real history books. In the last part of this review we covered Jane's early life and family dramas, her coming to court to serve Queen Catherine. We also see her loyalty to the old queen and her hatred for Anne Boleyn grow, even as she is forced to serve her. We also see Jane agonize over her lack of male attention and her pale looks. But now Jane finally has an admirer, and the admirer is the king. This is where we pick up on this review. Jane is awkward with Henry. She is very attracted to him, but hates the thought of hurting Queen Catherine. She also worries about her good name. Hurting Anne Boleyn doesn't even come into it. The summer progress has ended, and people now know what is going on between Henry and Jane. Some of the courtiers are trying to carry favour with her, but other people, Anne Boleyn in particular, are being rude and cruel to her. Anne even throws things at her. Anne is pregnant again though, and riding high in the king's favour, so Jane is afraid to say anything about Anne's cruelty to anyone. Then Anne loses the baby, another boy, and is devastated. So is Henry, but Jane is truly compassionate, because she feels sorry for Anne, despite the cruelties Anne has inflicted on her for months. This compassion is the reason so far in this series Jane is my favourite queen. Jane comforts Henry. She enjoys spending time with him, and though she will not agree to be his mistress, she agrees to be his friend. She listens to Henry's problems and soothes him, saying very little. Jane thinks a lot though, but judges it far wiser to hold her tongue. Jane Seymour the little mouse is much smarter than she looks. She truly is the complete opposite of Anne. Anne constantly speaks her mind. I think, more than anything, this showcases the differences between the way Jane and Anne were brought up. Anne was brought up around intelligent women who wielded power over men and were encouraged to think for themselves, whereas Jane was always told to keep her thoughts and opinions to herself, letting men take the lead. The different ways Anne and Jane act with Henry in private showcase this difference to the extreme. People at court know Jane has the king's favour, and she is approached by the Spanish ambassador and Richard Carew to intercede for Queen Catherine and Princess Mary. For the first time in Jane's life, she has some power that is wholly her own, but she is hesitant to use it, knowing that one slip of the tongue could make Henry angry. She is growing very fond of him, but knows in her heart that he can be cruel and ruthless, and it scares her. So Jane holds off speaking for Queen Catherine and Princess Mary. She also decides now is a bad time to speak for them because Anne is pregnant again. But then it is too late. Catherine has died, and Jane is truly saddened because she viewed Catherine as a second mother. Jane is appalled by Henry and Anne's lack of feeling, and disgusted by their rejoicing and wearing yellow. When Jane is told about the growth found on Catherine's heart by her brothers, she is convinced Anne Boleyn poisoned her. Jane is now very worried about the Princess Mary's safety, and decides to speak to Henry, but is discouraged to find that Henry believes Mary is a defiant child that must be brought to heel, and not simply a lonely child from a broken marriage and messy divorce. Jane continues to meet up with Henry though, and there is a bit of light petting going on at this stage, and Jane is growing to like Henry more and more. Then, just as things are looking rosy for Henry and Anne, Henry suffers that famous fall from his horse the day before Queen Catherine's funeral, and seeks comfort in Jane's arms. But they are caught red-handed by Anne Boleyn, with Jane sat on Henry's lap, with his hand on her breast. Anne flies into a jealous fury and miscarries yet another son. Jane feels very sorry for Anne in her bedchamber, weeping and wailing like a wounded animal. She thinks Anne does not have an enviable position, losing baby after baby, with the threat of divorce hanging over her. This is a rare moment of complete clarity for Jane, where she isn't yet completely head over heels in love with Henry, and realizes to some extent what she is getting herself into, and thinks that she would not want the Queen's position, because it is not an enviable one. Jane may feel sorry for Anne, but that doesn't stop her comforting a weeping Henry. Henry is in floods of tears, saying Anne can never give him a son and he should set her aside. Jane decides to bring up Mary Boleyn and the King and Anne's consanguinity, and Henry says he will have Archbishop Cranmer look into it. Henry is still very upset though, so Jane decides to comfort Henry with her body. She thinks acting kindly to him now will bind Henry closer to her in the future, so she goes to bed with him. Every time I read this scene, I am surprised by Jane's bravery in this situation. Henry could very easily sleep with her and then tire of her, like he did with Mary Boleyn. Jane rejoices in how natural their loving feels and how handsome Henry is. This is the main difference between Anne and Jane. Anne wanted a crown and cared nothing for the man who gave it to her, while Jane loves the man and sees the crown as a happy extra. Jane does want a crown, but it is more of an extra thought really. She wants Henry more. She even keeps his letters in her bodice next to her heart, whereas Anne always kept his letters in a box in her chamber. When Jane does think about becoming queen, it is mainly in the hopes of helping Princess Mary and restoring the old faith. Jane starts to worry a little that Henry will tire of her now that they have slept together, and that she could become pregnant. But she feels so loved by Henry, she thinks she is safe. She tells no one about them sleeping together, but her brother Edward lectures her constantly on morality and virtue. The king goes to Greenwich, leaving Queen Anne and Jane behind. Anne is even crueler than before, slapping and pinching Jane, and even rips a locket from Jane's neck, which holds Henry's picture. Jane is in very low spirits due to Anne's attacks, and missing Henry dreadfully. Then there comes that fateful letter in gold incident. Henry has sent Jane a letter and a large purse of gold publicly, which Jane sends back, saying it is not a suitable gift, but only because she remembers Edward's lectures on virtue. Inwardly, she wants to open the letter and keep the gold. This causes a lot of gossip about how the king is courting a virtuous woman, and Jane's brothers are convinced Jane is about to become queen. Jane is having a horrible time serving Queen Anne, who is continually rude and cruel to her. I like Jane a lot, but I think Anne's reaction to living with a woman who is trying to steal her husband was completely natural, even if it was excessively cruel. Then Anne moves to Greenwich to be with the king, and Jane is really excited to see Henry. But Henry completely ignores her, and Jane is devastated, convinced he has had her, and lost interest. A day and a half passes before Henry sends for Jane, and Henry has completely changed his mind about wanting a divorce, and is sleeping with Anne again. Jane is deeply saddened. She doesn't understand why Henry has said one thing and done another. Jane still loves Henry, but is very hurt by his actions and words. She still wants to be with him though, and he is still an ardent swain, even if he is sleeping with Anne and Jane at the same time. This double-dipping behaviour makes me feel sick, especially for poor Anne, who had no idea it was going on. Henry is worried that Anne is treating Jane cruelly, so he gives Lord Cromwell's apartments to Edward and Nan. Lord Cromwell happily vacated them, so that Jane could lodge with Edward and Nan, and leave Anne Boleyn's service. Jane is thrilled to be away from Anne's cruel gibes, but is less happy at having to lodge with bitchy Nan Bassett, who is the queen of the veiled insult. Henry visits Jane in the apartments every other night, and they are left alone, so one thing leads to another and they are having lots of sex. Jane is still worried about getting pregnant and apprehensive about her future, because Henry has not mentioned divorcing Anne for months. Then Edward informs Jane he has attended a secret meeting with members of the old royal house and Lord Cromwell, who have all agreed Anne must be deposed, and Jane is to become queen in her place, and the Princess Mary is to be restored to the succession. Jane thinks they are all getting ahead of themselves because Henry has not mentioned a divorce in months. Despite that, though, she can see her star rising at court. The court intrigues begin, and it is becoming clear the old royal family are taking a big interest in Jane, and she is convinced by them to speak against Anne to Henry. She doesn't want to hurt Anne, though. She imagines a quiet retirement somewhere in the country, where Anne can raise Elizabeth and disappear from view. The intrigues continue, and it is becoming clear that Cromwell and the old royal family want very different things out of the fall of Anne Boleyn. Jane tries to stay out of it, but becomes very upset when Eustace Chapuis acknowledges Anne as queen. Anne looks to be back in favour with the king, if he has finally made the Spanish ambassador acknowledge her. But then, a week or so later, Jane hears a rumour about the court that Anne has been unfaithful to the king, and starts to worry. She is questioned by Cromwell, and she fears that he is planning Anne's death. She doesn't want that on her conscience. She cannot believe that Anne has been unfaithful, because she is constantly attended. But then, while out in the park, Jane witnesses what she thinks is a tryst in the Tower of Mirefleur between Anne Boleyn and Henry Norris. She thinks Cromwell must be right. Even so, she cannot stand the idea of Anne's death. Jane is honestly a kind person, perhaps the kindest out of all of Henry's queens, especially now because she is pregnant and worried about her own future. Yet she still does not want to hurt Anne, the woman who tormented her for months. There is a lot of commotion in the court, and there has been a jury of peers called. Jane is freaked out and wonders if it is about Anne, but she doesn't have long to wait as Henry comes to her that night to explain all. He is very angry and screaming that Anne has betrayed him with a low-born musician. Jane is even scared of him. Jane is completely horrified when Henry announces Anne will be burnt alive, and in the next breath asks Jane to marry him. Jane is dumbstruck by Henry's train of thought, from murder to marriage, but agrees to marry him on the condition that he doesn't burn Anne. Jane then tells Henry that she is pregnant, and he is overjoyed. Henry VIII and his mood swings. The whole scene is very emotional, and I think it shows that Henry was so wound up by Cromwell and his plotting that he was not thinking clearly at this time. The next day is the fateful May Day, where the world was turned upside down. Jane thinks how odd it is that Henry can act normally at the jousts, even loaning Norris his horse, but he leaves early, and after the jousts are over, Jane hears the cannon roaring, announcing that a person of high rank has entered the Tower of London. Jane is guilt-ridden over Anne's fate, and is happy when Henry asks her to leave court for propriety's sake. This is the end of the second part of this book review. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, comment and subscribe so you will not miss the third part of this review, which is coming out after Christmas. You can also follow me on Instagram at Lady Jessica Riddell. Until next time, remember we are all bound to obey and serve.